Jai Baba, everyone. So I'm really sorry. I'm wearing my mask and I want to keep it on. I hope you can hear. Those of you who want to hear, I hope you can. I'll speak loudly and tell me if I need to speak more loudly. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for coming to listen to my stories. And before I begin, I just want to tell everyone, it's quite amazing to me when I think about it. The first time I ever spoke publicly about Baba was in the center 50 years ago. I was 16. And I'd done an interview with the Luck Brothers, but I'd never done anything like that. And I remember it so vividly. It took place in the library, and Jane introduced me. And in the front row, there's Margaret, Kitty, Elizabeth, Jane sat there, whoever else. And here I am telling my, few Baba stories to these ladies. And it was just incredible, and I haven't forgotten it after all this time. It was amazing. So it's wonderful to be back. And also, Jay and I haven't been here together for 24 years, so this just feels like such a home. Thank you. So I'm just going to tell my stories. I was a child when I met Baba. I think I'm very lucky to have met him as a child. I sometimes have wished, why couldn't I have met him as an adult? I would have asked him this and this and this and this. But I think I was very fortunate. Just as a little preamble, my father was Adi Jr., Baba's youngest brother. My mother was Shireen Irani, who some of you know. She spoke here. I'm Dara Irani's sister. I'm the cousin to Saurabh and Rustam. I think some of you might have stayed at Vilu Villa back in the day and knew Sarosh. Sarosh was my mother's uncle. So pretty tight family, actually. So I first met Baba when I was a baby. I was lucky enough that, he held me and like he did with so many babies. But after I was born in London, my mum really wanted to take me to India to meet Baba. And of course, the Lady Mandali. And, she told some really great stories about that. But of course, like any parent with a baby, she really hoped that I wouldn't make a mess on Baba's lap. And thank goodness I didn't. So apparently I enjoyed meeting him very much and was gurgling away and all of that. My family, we were the only ones of Baba's family to live away from India, to live in the West. My father and mother were the only people. My dad was Baba's only sibling to have left India. And I was born in London. So in that way, we were quite different. I was raised differently to my cousins. And we lived in England. I was born in the late 50s. And the school I went to, and in fact, even where we lived, everything was Church of England. That was England back then. I went to a little, primary school, and we said the prayers, and as I say, it was all about, Christ and Church of England. So I grew up with photos of Baba all over our house. But I think, my memory until the age of 7, when I met him properly, was that he was my uncle. So that's what I knew, that he was my uncle. But I knew there was something a little different because not many people had that many, our house was just emblazoned with photos of Baba. So the age of 7, as most of you know, that's the age when children go to India. But the catalyst was all of us, Baba himself, we were Zoroastrian. And my paternal grandfather, who was Sarosh Irani's brother, my mother's father, really wanted me to have the Najat ceremony, which was the Zoroastrian sort of entering the religion ceremony, very similar to confirmation and that sort of thing. And he was sort of a bigwig in Ahmednagar. Sarosh was the mayor of Ahmednagar. I don't know if any of you know that. So my grandfather had many honorifics from the British, and it was very important to him that his granddaughter, who was, in far-flung England, came back for the Nawjat ceremony. So that coincided very nicely with what seemed like the right age for us to go to India. And when I say us, my mother, my father, my brother Dara Irani, who I'm sure many of you have met or heard speak, and myself. And that was the big trip in my family and in my life. So we went in 1964, 1965. We were there for a few months. I took time off school, I remember that. It was a long, long visit. So prior to that, my father thought it was a good idea to tell me who Baba was. And I remember he sat me down and said, Shireen, you go to school, you say the prayers, the hymns, you hear about Christ, and Baba, your uncle, is Christ come again. He is God in human form. So, of course, I took this completely in my stride. I was 7. So I was just thrilled. I was just absolutely thrilled. And, we were going to meet him. And so then my parents told me a little bit about my aunties and who we'd meet. So the excitement I felt, and again, all these years on, I just remember so well the excitement, the preparations, going to India, going to meet Baba. So before going to meet Baba, I told my friend in school that I was going to meet God. She was completely, cool, calm and collected, not a big deal. And so the two of us came up with some questions to ask Baba, which I did later ask him. I included them in the many, many questions I asked him. So the great day came, we left for India, and, I just experienced nothing like it. We were met at the airport, or maybe a train station, by just so many family members, including Vilu and Sarosh, a huge entourage. It was just this feeling of incredible excitement. Prior to that, my mum had gone completely berserk making me outfits to meet Baba. Just these this was the early 60s, very sort of frou-frou, lots of polyester and sequins and that kind of thing. And I was very done up. I mean, that was the plan for meeting Baba. So we got to India, and my mum and I stayed with her parents, who lived across the field from Vilu Villa, if any of you remember that. And my dad stayed at Merazad with Baba, and Dara stayed with his uncle and aunt, Vilu and Sarosh. So after a day, I suppose, the really big day came, and we went to see Baba. My mum dressed me up to the nines. I had really long hair. She put it in ringlets, ribbons, rags, as you did in those days. There was just such this sort of bubbling excitement. So Baba sent his car for us. And there must have been another car. Perhaps Sarosh drove, my dad. Dara. But I remember we got into Baba's car and were driven to Merazad. And again, I just can picture it, the what seemed like a long road to me, but just going down the road, parking, all the women were there to greet us. I'd never been, I had a very loving family, but I'd never been so completely overwhelmed by this love and attention from all these people who were my relations. And I met Mara and Money. I think Mara perhaps was in the back. I'm not sure if she came out. So we all piled out of the car, and I think that's in the film that might be shown tomorrow. And we were then to go into Mandalay Hall to meet Baba. And my father had given me very strict instructions as to how to behave. For any of you who've taken your children to meet the Mandalay, you know that you'd be nervous and hoping that they behave. And I think for my parents especially, because we were different, because we were from England and I was born in England and I wasn't an Indian child, they really wanted to make sure that I behaved myself. So my dad really told me this was a solemn occasion. So he said, don't run up to Baba. Don't hug Baba. don't throw yourself at Baba. And we all had garlands, and he just told me to hold my garland, walk up to Baba in his chair at Mundley Hall, place the garland on him, bow down, touch his feet, and go. So I was very cognizant of that instruction. And we were sort of queuing up to go in. And again, I was dressed up to the nines. And I remember clutching my garland so that, flowers were falling off. I really wanted to remember to do this properly. So we walk in, and there's Baba. And of course, he's sitting in his chair, beaming with this huge, arms open. So, of course, everything my father told me just out my head. I dropped the garland, I think, and I ran into Baba's arms and hugged him. And, how could I not? So that, for me, was the beginning of my relationship with Baba. And those remaining however many months it was, I always thought it was 3, it might have been 2. That's how it was. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was very, very fortunate. I mean, I knew I was fortunate, but I was also really spoiled because Baba was everything I expected. He was perfect. He was very avuncular. I mean, really, he was. And he was just so sweet and so playful and so happy. Our visits were family visits. There were no pilgrims. It was going to see my family. It was going to see my uncle, who happened to be God in human form. So those days at Merazad were absolutely magical. And, when my father told me that Baba was God, I was 7. And like every child, or most children, I had a very active imagination. So, I believed in fairies and Father Christmas and everyone, Peter Pan. I really just believed in everything. And magicians. And so Baba, I thought, well, this is incredible. This is everything I believe all in one. He can do anything. He'll tell me things. I was just so excited. So Baba was, as I said, very, very sweet and very indulgent. And, I'm sure I was annoying. And he just always, I don't like to say this about Baba, but, came to my level. So from that moment when I forgot everything my father said and I hugged Baba and he hugged me, every day that we were in India, I wanted to be with him. So there were certain days when we couldn't go there, but they were rare. Mostly we were there every day, at least part of a day. And, the thrill of being taken back in Baba's car and then the next day getting all dolled up again to go back to Merazad, to know that was going to happen was just so exciting to me. So I'm just going to tell you some of the many stories, really. Some of my favourite ones centred around the dining room. Probably some of you have been into Mera's dining room. So that's where, of course, Baba and the ladies would eat, and we would eat there. My mum and I would eat there, and Dara and my father would eat with the men. And Mani was so kind and gave me her seat, which was on Baba's left. And so Mera was on Baba's right. So I'm sitting there right next to Baba. And we were just having, we would have a very a family lunch, we just chit-chat and talk about things. And one day, Baba noticed that I really was playing with my food because the food was Indian food, which I didn't like at all. And that was one of my parents' concerns, was I going to be this fusspot and sort of show them up by only wanting English food? So I was trying to be polite, so but it was rice and dal. So Baba looked at me and said, don't you like the food? And I think I said, oh, I like it, Baba. I was lying, but I didn't want to be rude. I said, oh, I like it. And then he sort of watched me eating it a little bit more. And perhaps I made some kind of an excuse. And then again, I said, well, no, I like it, Baba, I like it. But he said, but you're not eating it. So I turned to him to say something, and he had taken a big, handful of rice and dal from his plate and shoved it in my mouth. And I swallowed it, And absolutely, it happened. From that second, I loved rice and dal. Indian foods, my favorite food. Another time in the dining room, just little treats. He would ask for ice cream to be served, so I could have ice cream. But a very lovely thing that happened, and it's not often in my life that I've had an experience like this at all. This is not a typical thing for me. But this one time, Barbara performed a little mini miracle, and it made me very happy. So someone from Australia, I think, had sent a big tin of fruit salad. Now, back then, fruit salad was, in a tin, and there might be one or two cherries, and the cherries were the prize. So Barbara asked after lunch, would you like some fruit salad? And I said, oh, yes, please. So Katie, I think it was Katie, could have been Naja, could have been Goher. One of the ladies was serving the fruit salad, and Barbara said, give Shireen the cherries. And that was great. I thought, okay, great, I'm getting all the cherries. So I had the cherries, and Barbara had a big smile on his face and said, did you like the cherries? And I said, oh, yes, I love them. Thank you. And so he said to whoever was serving, see if there are more cherries. And let's say it was Katie, I think it was her. She said, oh, Barbara, they only give one or two cherries in these tins. I've given Shireen the cherries, but she had a look. Barbara said, have a look. So she looked and she found some more cherries. So she was a little surprised. So I got a few more cherries, and Barbara watched me eat them. And then he said, did you like that? And I said, yes, I like that very much, thank you. And he said, do you want some more cherries? And Katie said, no, Barbara, there are no more cherries. That's finished. And lo and behold, there were more cherries. And I don't remember how often this happened, but it happened a lot. And they just kept coming. I mean, money used to tell the story, but it really was above and beyond. Unless there had been some big mistake at the factory, Barbara just kept producing these cherries, which of course for me was both wonderful but also not so surprising, because of course he could do that. And another thing involving food that I just loved was he would often have a bowl of soup in Munderley Hall, sort of as a snack. And I would sit at his feet in Munderley Hall, and then he would let me drink from his soup bowl. And I really liked that. I liked the taste of it. I liked the fact that I could do that. As I said, he was really playful. We used to play a game, as some of you may know or remember or have seen on, if you ever watched Monty Python. But in England, there was a sort of a habit. Men would knot a handkerchief in four corners, and often that would be a sun hat. If you went to the seaside, you didn't have a hat, you put this hat hanky on. So Barbara and I would, I would knot these hankies, and he put it in on his head, then I put it on my head. So we played this little game with the hankies. I remember that. And then another time that was, it's just so sweet to me. Someone had bought me a handbag, a raffia handbag from the bazaar, and I loved this bag so much. So I clutched it, everywhere I went, like the Queen. I had my handbag with me. And then Barbara was on Mera's porch, and my Aunt Money, wanted to play a game with me. And the game meant that I had to put down my handbag. And I really didn't want to let go of, I remember this so well, I didn't want to let go of my bag. So I remember looking at the bag and looking at Barbara and looking at Money and thinking, what do I do? So then I took my bag to Barbara and asked him to hold my handbag. And he said he would. And so then I went down and played my game with Money, the whole time keeping an eye on my handbag. And Barbara was sitting there like this. He said he'd look after it. It was just so touching. I love Barbara's room because it was pink, and I was a real girly girl. I love the fact that it was pink. And I really liked being in Barbara's room. I'd sit on his bed and we would just, chat and talk about friends and school and goodness knows what. I mean, I was just babbling away, and he listened. He always smiled and he asked questions. And something I didn't like it. So Barbara would have a nap in the afternoon. I didn't like that because I was told like that, I could not disturb him, and I had enough sense to know that I shouldn't disturb him. But what was great though about those times is that was when I really got to know my aunties, Mera, Mani, go ahead, Katie, Annavaz. I'm forgetting someone, Meru, but especially Mera and Mani, who later on just was so profoundly important in my life. And they, organized our wedding. I mean, they just were everything to me. So during those nap times when I was itching to play with Baba, at least that was when I got to know them a little bit. And to pass the time, Goher let me use her bicycle. So I'd cycle all around Merazad. And, as is typical, when you're a child, what seems big then doesn't seem so big now. But Merazad gardens were huge, There were all these secret passages in my mind. And, I'd really been admonished to not disturb Baba. So I'm on my little bike, going all around. And I don't know if this is... I haven't been to India for 30 years. We haven't. I don't know if this is correct or this is something in my imagination in terms of whether I would have seen Baba through a window. But I found what I thought was a secret passage to Baba's room on my bike. So I thought, well, this is great. I can go in now and see him. And all it was the entrance to the side door to his room. It was nothing secret. But I have in my mind that I could see him through the window, and I don't know if that's correct because I don't remember what the room is like. But I remember peeking and somehow being beckoned in. So even though Baba was supposed to be napping, he saw me or knew I was there, and I went in. And I did that a lot until my father found out and then told me I couldn't do that anymore. Baba had his beautiful dog Mustan. I'm sure you all know about Mustan. And he really was gorgeous. He was huge. And I was frightened of him. And Baba seemed to want me to become friends with Mustan. So Baba tried to, enable us to become friends. And he said the way to do that was I should feed Mustan. And Mustan always got a raw egg. So there's actually a photo of me very, very gingerly holding, this bowl of raw egg to Mustan. But I liked him, and I remember how much Baba loved Mustan and vice versa. They were just so, so sweet together. And of course, Mani's Peter. So early on, I think, during the visit, we were in Mandalay Hall, and I had all these questions that I had for Baba, and I hadn't told my parents because I sensed that they probably would tell me in no way should I ask Baba any of this stuff. So, and I was feeling quite emboldened. Baba was so lovely. I was definitely this, 7-year-old, just free reign of Merazad. And I felt a little bit like I could ask Baba these questions. I didn't feel I'd get into any kind of trouble for it. And I didn't, not from Baba. But so one day, I don't remember if Baba asked me if I had anything to ask him or if I just put my hand up and said, Baba, I have questions. So I stood in front of Baba and started rattling them off. And I really remember my father. We were all very well dressed. I think my dad was wearing a suit a lot of the time. My mum wore a sari. I was dressed in whatever concoction, of the day. Dara wore a suit. And I just remember my father with that very kind of slight kind of flicker in his eyes. Oh, what is she going to say? And anyway, I started to ask Baba a series of questions. And what was so great was that he answered every single one. He, answered in a way that I could understand. He took every single question seriously. And I don't remember this, but this is what my parents had told me, that at the end of it, Erich said to my dad, "Did you put her up to this?" And my father said, "I had no idea that, Shireen was going to ask these questions." So I can tell you some of them if you like, but they're in various, I think they're in the family letters. So, well, the question that I concocted with my friend was, we wanted to know what was higher in the sky: the sun, the moon, the stars, clouds, something else. So Baba listened, and he said, "I am the highest of the high." So that was good. I like that. I also asked him, I think I had seen a painting of Baba where he had a halo. And I asked him why, when I looked at him, I couldn't see the halo around him. And he said something along the lines, I don't remember exactly, of, "When you see me for who I truly am and love me for who I truly am, then you will see me in that form." So that, I understood that. Then I had, maybe this was also concocted with my friend, but I was very concerned about witches. And I wanted Baba to tell me once and for all, are witches real? And I thought he would say, "Oh, of course not. Don't worry. No, don't worry." But he listened, and then he waited, and he looked serious. And I thought, oh, no, he's going to tell me these things are real. And he said, "Yes, they are real." And I was very concerned. And he said, "But witches are bad people." He said, they don't have brooms. They don't have pointy hats. They're bad people. I said, okay, that was good. I could understand that. I asked him a little bit about reincarnation, and I asked him if I would have the same parents. And he said no, which made me sad. I didn't pursue that with him, but I was really hoping he'd say, "Yes, you'll have the same ones," again and again and again. I asked him if I could have a brother or sister. He said no. He said, you're enough for your mother. So that was a little disappointing. I asked him about snakes and scorpions. So even though I grew up in England and really hadn't had much contact with any of these creatures, thank God, I think between my mum telling me about them, warning me not to stick my hands, she, being careful, she told me how these creatures exist in India. So perhaps that troubled me. And I think the snake in The Little Prince also, that was something that stuck with me. So once we got to India, I was worried about snakes, particularly. And I still am, And so I asked Baba why he invented snakes and scorpions and nasty things like that. I'm paraphrasing. And I remember that Baba answered this question, but it's written up somewhere that he asked Erich to reply. I remember that Baba answered. So Baba, there was a two-part answer, and Baba said to me, "What do you think of when you see these creatures?" And, I said, "Well, Baba, they frighten me. They really frighten me." And he said, "Well, when you're frightened, who do you think of?" And I said, "Well, I think of you." And he said, "Sometimes, we need help to remember God. So when you see these creatures, you think of me." So apparently I didn't like that answer. It wasn't. I was really hoping for him to say, "Well, I'll get rid of them, if you don't like them." Because at that point I was just, anything I say to Baba, he'll have an answer for. So then he gave a more down-to-earth response about bathroom habits and how we have to go to the bathroom to keep ourselves healthy. And he said in that way, both good and bad are his. And, I wasn't fully on board with, that response, because I was hoping for a bit more of, well, you'll never see one in your life, or something along those lines. I'm probably forgetting a few of the questions that I asked him, but anyway, it was memorable in that I don't really know where these questions came from, especially the more sort of esoteric ones. I don't know how I heard about reincarnation, but I had these questions in me, and Baba was gracious enough to answer them. I have no idea if there's a connection whatsoever. I'm not suggesting there is, but I find it interesting that when I was 11, Baba gave me the order to never read any of his books. So it's almost as though I got some of those questions out of my system, and then that was the end of it. I really don't know. So as I mentioned, we were there in India to meet Baba, but also for my Navjot ceremony, which was really a big, big event. And again, because my uncle was the mayor, all of Ahmednagar was there, all sorts of British bigwigs, and I had to learn Zoroastrian prayers, never having learned a Zoroastrian prayer in my life. It's quite an elaborate ceremony. So I was told that I had to take really serious lessons from a Zoroastrian Dastor, the priest. And I had to learn a ton of prayers in a very short amount of time. And that was going to be difficult for me because I just wanted to be with Baba. So I remember arguing with my mother and saying, no, I don't want to. I want to be with Baba. But we had to work it out, so I could be with Baba and still learn my prayers. And I remember this really elderly priest coming to my grandparents to teach me the prayers, and I wasn't really doing a very good job of learning them. Well, right slap bang in the middle of that, Baba asked my parents if I knew the O Pavadigar prayer. And they said, no, she's quite young. And Baba said, I want her to learn it. And he gave my mum a deadline. And my mum sort of said, oh, Baba, she's got to learn these Zoroastrian prayers. And Baba said, never mind, she'll learn the O Pavadigar too. So my mum was fairly frantic because she was trying to work out how on earth we could fit that in. Because, the Pavadigar prayers, I would say, rather tricky for a 7-year-old to learn. And so the only time was when my hair was down to here, down to my mid-thigh, was when she was combing out my hair full of knots. And that was when she taught me the Pavadigar prayer. So on the day of my Navjot, this poor Dastor was tearing his hair out because I wasn't learning anything with him. I was constantly, my mind was on Baba. I wanted to go and play with Baba. It was just like that for me. But the day of the Navjot came, and in the morning, my real ceremony was with Baba. So we all went to Merazad, and I remember standing on a little stool in front of him. And with the Navjot ceremony, you're given a sadra, which you all know, and a kasti. And the kasti is a sacred thread that you tie around your waist. And that's part of the very, very prolonged ceremony in the Navjot. But with Baba, he handed me my sadra and kasti. It was very sweet. And he just gave them to me. And that morning, I had to say the Pavadigar prayer in front of Baba. And I did it. I got it right. So that was what we always considered the Navjot. Then I had the big, pomp and circumstance where I got every single prayer wrong and basically showed up, my entire family because I couldn't learn those prayers. So that was, I remember at the time being very touched by that. It was, I knew, I understood, even though I was only 7, I understood this is real. What's happening later isn't real, but it's important that we do it for my grandparents. Am I forgetting anything, Jay? From that time? So our time there drew to a close. Oh, there is something. I'm forgetting this. You have to understand, this is all told from the prism of a child. And, a lot of children, we're the center of our own universe, I think, to a point. So everything I saw and felt and experienced was, Baba and me. I did notice, though, I did have the, breadth of consciousness to see how much Baba loved Mera and how close they were. And what fun my Aunt Money was. What fun she was. Just a joy. For those of you who've met her, you don't need me to say any more. So it was so sweet for me to know my aunties. I'm going to go to Spat Trap for a minute. One thing that I forgot. So, I'm sure you've heard many, many, many people tell their stories of meeting Baba and how Baba loved to be entertained. And of course, again, any parent taking their child, I'm sure I took little gifts that I'd made in school. But my parents wanted me to be able to do something to entertain Baba. And I'm not being falsely self-deprecating. I was what you'd call a talentless child. There was absolutely nothing that I could do. Except all they could think of was I went to school and we sang hymns. So my parents said I had to sing All Things Bright and Beautiful to Baba. So I can remember standing in Mundley Hall, which again seemed 10 times larger than it really is, no accompaniment, and having to just sing this hymn. It was fine, but I just was very self-conscious. So that planted a little seed in me for what would happen when we went to visit Baba in 1968 and 1969. One thing, though, that happened that, it's just, you have to indulge me, but again, as a child, this was so great. So one day, my dad decided that I was annoying Baba too much, and I was too much of a pest, and I was asking too many questions, and I was just generally getting on everyone's nerves. So he told me that I couldn't go to Merazad that day. And I just was so upset. I got all dressed up, and I remember sort of weeping and wailing. So I'm sure my mum stayed back with me, and I can't remember how we got the message, because I think my father used to collect us, and we'd all go in Baba's car, I think. So I was really in a bad mood. And anyway, hours passed, or a few hours passed, and Baba's car came back. So Baba had said to my dad, "Where's Shireen?" I mean, can you imagine? And my dad said, "Oh, Baba, we thought she was annoying you too much, and, we thought you needed a break." And he said, "Go and get her." And I mean, for me, that was, and of course, my father had been the authority in my life. It was like, no, Baba has said this. That was a really, really good day for me. So, well, the time came to say goodbye, and we had been there for such a long time, so it felt unreal to go home. I mean, to go home, to go back to school, none of it really made sense. But in the interim, and I think I'm forgetting some stuff. You're not helping me. You can't think of anything? No. In the interim, the years that we left India and then went back, so we left in 1965 and went back in 1968 for Darren Amrit's wedding. So in that interim period when we weren't with Baba, we were in constant touch. Now, of course, my parents had been in touch with him always. I perhaps just hadn't realized it. But what changed was that I could be in touch with him. So I just wrote these endless letters to him. And, he wrote back. When I say he wrote back, obviously somebody wrote for him, but they were always signed Baba. So I would write to him about anything. And I often think about this. How is it possible? Baba would get these letters and he'd write back to me. He was getting letters from everyone, from everywhere. And the only other person I know who's ever been able to cast their net so wide and make each person feel as though they really mattered was my Aunt Money. I mean, when I think about the hundreds of letters that she and I exchanged, she was doing that with everybody, not just me. Anyway, so Baba would write back, and by that time we had a dog. I had really wanted a dog who actually came from Buckingham Palace, but that's another story. And, Baba did this again with everyone, but he'd send telegrams and he'd always mention our dog as well. It was just so sweet. So I'd write him these letters, he'd write back, and I would write airmail paper, very thin, sort of onion skin airmail paper. And I would put kisses everywhere, and they were all over. And so one day I got a letter back saying, Baba asks that you do not put so many kisses because no one can read what you've written. So I was told to hold back on the kisses. So a few things happened before we went back to India. One, it sounds so trivial, but for me it was huge. So I had very long hair, as I mentioned, and I really wanted to cut it. No one in England had long hair at that time. Well, because Baba had admired it, Mera said to my mum, Shireen should not cut her hair. So I think I had the good sense when I was 7 not to ask about this anymore, but my dad went to India. Baba was in seclusion, but he called my father to India in 1968 to discuss Dara and Amrit's wedding preparations. So I thought, well, this is good, because I can send a message to Baba. So I said to my dad, please ask Baba if I can cut my hair. Please, 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 I want to cut my hair. I was obsessed with this. And I remember my dad sent a postcard. I have it somewhere, and it's great news. Baba says you can cut your hair. Now, again, I know this sounds so trivial, but, to me it was important. And then I went 6 to 8 inches. Well, on hair that long, that's a trim. So that completely flattened my excitement. But the other big thing that happened, apart from obviously my dad going to Baba and talking about the wedding, but for me was that in England, anyway, in those days, you go to what's called a primary school until the age of 11. And then at the age of 11, you go to a senior school. And you're there from the age of 11 to 18. And the time had come for me to apply to my senior schools. And for whatever reason, I applied to what are called public schools in England, fee-paying schools here. So I wasn't going to go to a state school, I was going to go to a public school. And as with everything, my parents consulted, Baba, if not Baba, Mera. So my parents let Baba know the schools I was interested in. And somehow, even before he got that letter or telegram or whatever it was, my parents got the message that Baba wanted me to go to St. Paul's Girls' School, where Kitty Davey went. So when my mum heard that poor thing, she completely panicked, because it was then, and I think still might be, the most academic, prestigious, impossible to get into school in all of England. So then word was sent back to Baba that, we don't think Shireen can do this. And Baba said, no, she's got to take the exam. Meanwhile, my dad was in India, leaving my mum with all of this stress. And she took it so seriously. Well, Baba said he wants Shireen to go to St. Paul's. Somehow, this has to happen. So she talked to my teachers who said, Shireen's reasonably intelligent, but no way. It's not going to happen. Children just don't get into that school. I mean, it's very, very hard. So Mum thought, well, I've got to do it. So I sat exams for all these other posh public schools. And then the St. Paul's exam came up. So, again, my father's in India with Baba, having a nice time, or discussing very important things. And my mum was feeling this intense pressure. So Baba sent a telegram wishing me good luck for the exam. So I went into the exam. I think I must have gone for the interview first, because they would never have given me the exam. I went in for the interview, and I didn't even see a headmistress. She was called the High Mistress. And her name was Mrs. Monroe. And I can't tell you how posh this school was. I mean, it just, such a pedigree, and it was very intimidating. So my dad, waltzes off to India, and my mum is at home, really sort of nervous and, like I say, sort of panicking slightly. And the only thing he said to me before I went, he said, "Don't worry, Baba will help you. It'll be fine." But he said, "Just remember, the Prime Minister of India is Mrs. Indira Gandhi." Yeah. So I said, "Okay, bye, Daddy," because I just I wasn't remotely thinking I was going to get into the school. I knew I had to try. So the day came for my interview, and I went in and sat with this very imposing woman, and I know I was completely useless. I did such a bad job, or whatever she asked me, I didn't answer properly. Maybe I'd already given up. So then she said, "Okay, thanks, bye." And I went to leave and kind of pulled this really heavy oak door. I remember this door was creaking. And she said, "Oh, just wait a minute." And I said, "Yes." And I had to curtsy to her. It was like that. And she said, "Do you know who the Prime Minister of India is?" And I was like, bingo. I said, "Yes, Mrs. Indira Gandhi." So, okay, I left. Great. So then I had my written exam. And my poor mum, she was just feeling really bad because she was trying to think, "I'll do my best. We'll do what Baba asked. If Shireen doesn't get in, it's your will, Baba." So I sat my written exam, and at some point, well before the exam ended, I walked out. And my mum saw me and thought, "What on earth is going on?" Well, I was really ill. I had German measles. And we didn't know it. So that was it. That was finished, It was like, no, okay, we've done everything we can. My mum was, meanwhile, sending telegrams back and forth to India. And my dad was saying, "Baba says, don't worry, Shireen will get in. Everything will be fine." So I didn't even complete the exams. Well, I got in. I got in. And when they got the news, the teachers phoned my mum. My form teacher phoned my mum and said, "What on earth did Shireen do to get into this school?" And, she walked out of the exam. She didn't even finish the exam. So, of course, Baba made that happen. And, I sometimes thought about, well, why, Baba had better things to do. Why did he want me to go to this school? And it dawned on me, many years after I left, it made Kitty really happy. She loved talking to me about St. Paul's. And that, to my mind, can be the only reason that Baba made this possible. And because, it was an ongoing discussion that she and I had. You probably know Kitty's music teacher anyway, Gustav Holst, was the music teacher at St. Paul's. When Kitty was there, we'd talk about Holst. So that's my St. Paul's story. That's why I think I went. And I don't know if there's time to tell a very sweet...
10 minutes tonight.
Oh. Well, I'll just tell it really quickly. So, I got into St. Paul's. Everyone was happy. Lovely telegrams of congratulations came from Baba. And so then it was that winter that we went to India for Darren Amrit's wedding. So I just started my term at St. Paul's. So my parents didn't have any money. And it was a fee-paying school. Baba had prior asked Donkin to be my godfather, Dr. Donkin. And he and my dad really got on. My dad loved his British humour and his British everything. They really hit it off. So Donkin was very happy to be my godfather. So Baba asked Donkin if he would pay my school fees for St. Paul's, which he did. And that was how I was able to go. Well, Baba dropped his body in 1969, and Donkin died a few months afterwards, I think, and he hadn't changed his will. So suddenly, I no longer was going to get my school fees paid. So my parents, I'm going ahead now to after Baba dropped his body. My parents were devastated. I was I would have been very upset. I loved the school. I'd made friends. And they really felt that Baba had wanted this so badly that they were going to try to make it happen. Donkin had a twin sister called Mary Matheson, who lived in the country in England. She was very well off, sort of posh English. Didn't know about Donkin, didn't know about his book, barely knew he'd lived in India. Well, everything in his will went to her, because he hadn't changed anything. There's a story about how even his possessions, which were meant to go to the trust, that didn't happen in the will. It was complicated. So my father found her name and number and phoned her, and it must have been very, very hard for him. He phoned her and explained who he was, and she was like, what? Who? Donkin in India? I mean, I don't know whether they've been I don't know. There are people here who know. I don't know about that. She really didn't know about Donkin's life in India. She could have just slammed down the phone. She could have said, leave me alone. She said, all right, come and see me. Because he said, I am asking you to fulfill Donkin's wishes that just hadn't been made absolute in this will. So I remember we took the train to her house in the country. She had 2 daughters, and they sort of took me off somewhere. And my parents spoke to her, and they just said, this is what Donkin wanted. And they were able to provide letters and even some bank statements and cancelled checks. They were able to provide proof that Donkin wanted to pay my school fees. But that was all. Well, by the end of that visit, she was so moved by what my dad told her about Donkin's life in India and with Baba. She paid my fees for, 7 years. Not only that, she didn't have to do that, but she did. Once I left school, she didn't pay for my university, but I was at university for 4 years because I had a year in Italy. She sent, some money every term or every year to help me with books and so on. I lived in Italy for a year. She sent me money. I mean, she went above and beyond. So a lot of trouble was gone to have me go to this school. And like I say, to me, it's very clear cut. It was Kitty, who, by the way, my father and Kitty were very close. My father met Kitty, Delia, Margaret, possibly Elizabeth. Anyway, my dad was 18 when he met all these ladies. So before Baba dropped his body, before Donkin died, I started at St. Paul's, and my parents were planning Dara Namrat's wedding, as I said. And because I'd started at St. Paul's and because it was a strict school, my father wrote to the High Mistress and said, we're going to India, could Shireen leave school early for the Christmas term? And she wrote a very sort of stern letter back and said, no, we don't let our girls do that. She cannot miss any school. So then my mum wrote to Mera and said, please ask Baba if we can postpone the wedding to the summer of 1969. And Baba telegrammed or wrote back and said, no, it's December 68 or nothing. Because obviously he knew what was going to come. So that we only could go for about, I think I had about a four week break. So the second trip to India could not have been more different to the first. I mean, first of all, this was all for Dara Namrat's wedding, which was just so exciting and big, And I was so excited because I was going to get a sister, and I thought, well, they'll have children, and I'll get the brother or sister that Barbara told me that I couldn't have. I was just really excited about this because Dara and Amrit lived in England for about 4 years after they married, and then they moved to India. But the other thing that was so different about this trip was that Baba really was frail, and we knew he'd been unwell. And again, my dad told me exactly the same, as before. Don't hug him, don't jump on him, and all those things. And I tried hard to do that. I wanted to do that. But how could I, still Baba opened his arms wide and I hugged him. But I remember being conscious of the fact that he just did not look the same. And so I was a little more gentle. There was so much sort of flurry to do with the wedding. So many plans. Amrit was ill. I remember that very strongly. And I remember the wedding, very, very clearly. In terms of my relationship with Baba, I was that much older. There's a huge difference between 7 and 11. And I was I was much more self-conscious. I thought, well, Baba knows everything I'm thinking, everything, good and bad. And then the other thing, and again, it might sound very trivial, but it was big to me. So when I was 7, I was, sort of cute, and my mum dressed me up in these outfits. When I was 11, the puppy fat had set in, and she was still dressing me in these outfits. And I remember for one of the events for the wedding, I wore the most extraordinary dress that she had crocheted. I mean, this was 1968. So crochet dresses, if anyone remembers, were in, and it was lurex, it was silver. And I had silver tights, and I had silver shoes. And I had my hair in a bun, and she liked to put little crowns on my head. And I mean, my mum was, the most wonderful person in the world, but she really did trust me. By then it was like, no, this wasn't a good look for me. So I was very self-conscious, as I say, and I think I was a bit scowly. Certainly, I think in the wedding film, I'm scowling quite a lot because I'm having to wear this outfit. So I felt more self-conscious. And this was just capped off by the fact that on the previous visit to India, Mera mentioned that she loved ballet. I don't know if she loved ballet. So Mum thought that was a sign that I should start taking ballet lessons. So I started taking them, I don't know, I think age 8. She consulted Margaret Crask, who said, children shouldn't start ballet until they're 8 because their bones haven't formed. So I was okay, I wasn't great. And then I became progressively worse. And also very reluctant to do this class. And I was so bad that my teacher, who somehow was connected to Margaret Cross and who was really nice, said to me that I was literally giving her nightmares. And she said to my mum, if you want Shireen to continue, I have to tell you, A, she should not continue. But my mum thought, no, Mera wants her to, she had that idea that Mera wanted me to take ballet. And so my teacher, Miss Brochin, said, well, Shireen, I can't do anything with her in a class. She needs private lessons, because I was that bad. And that made me sort of feel even more reluctant. So I was just doing these classes. And again, not the right time for me to be wearing a leotard. I was rapidly, going through that pre-pubescent, just not good. And so, meanwhile, though, I was ice skating, and I was actually very, very good at that, and I did that competitively. So I had that going for me. So when we went to India for the wedding, again, there was this thought in my mind, and it came up with my parents, well, entertainment for Baba. And I thought, great, I'll come up with something. Not dreaming that word would have got to Mera that I was doing these ballet lessons, and I had a dance to do for Baba. So it was really bad. So I had learnt with this poor ballet teacher who was, very nice to me. She felt sorry for me. A dance called the Tarantella. And some of you may, I had to wear a little headscarf, and I had a rose between my teeth, and I was wearing, my tutu and an apron, and I had a tambourine, and it was just so awful. And I had to just dance around, because I think the idea was that I was a peasant, and I had been bitten by a tarantula, and I'd gone mad. Something like that. Something along those lines. So, it all transpires that I'm supposed to do this dance for Baba. And I remember saying to my mum, please, no, it was all happening. So I forget where it came, the sequence of the wedding, which was, of course, what I'm talking about is so insignificant. I mean, the wedding was everything. So the day came where I had to do this dance. And I remember just saying to my mum, please, no, Mary Auntie wants you. No, you've got to do this dance. So because Baba wasn't feeling well that day, I was going to do this performance in Mundley Hall. And he couldn't get out of bed. He wasn't well. So I had to do it in his bedroom. Well, his bedroom's small. And there were so many people in the bedroom. And then there's me, in my outfit. And so I've got to find a little spot where I can dance around and then progressively go more and more, frantic, because I'm poisoned. So I remember standing there in my little outfit, looking, very just ungainly. Ungainly is the word I would use. And praying to Baba, looking at him, praying, saying, please, 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 stop this. Stop it, please. So then, oh joy, we had bought a little cassette player with the music, and the tape didn't work. And I thought, oh, thank you, Baba, I can't do it. So I was sort of all ready to pack up. And then Baba or someone said, or Mera said, no, we'll just clap. We'll clap. And Shireen will dance to the clapping. So no music, Baba's room, nothing to guide me except clapping. And there's me, dressed like that. And I had to stomp around Baba's room doing my dance until finally I land on the floor writhing. That's how it ended. And of course Baba was smiling and thought it was just wonderful and it was so great, and all that. Well, once we got home, I can't remember how long it took, but I said to my mum, that's finished, no more ballet for me. But what was so great was that I had I had already formulated in my mind that finally there was something I could do for Baba. So the one thing I was good at was I could tell jokes. And again, without telling my parents, I asked Baba if I could tell him jokes, and I did. And that went down really well, and I knew that I'd hit the mark. I was good. Baba really laughed. So I won't tell them now because I don't think there's time. But if there's time, I'll tell them at the end. But so there was a wonderful Irish comedian in England in those days called Dave Allen. If anyone has heard of him, and he was so great. So we would watch his show as a family, and he was very suave, and droll, and just so funny. And he had, of course, this wonderful Irish accent. So I think he'd start his show. No, he'd end it. He'd end his show. It was a sort of variety sketch show. He'd end it by sitting on a stool with a glass of scotch, and you knew it was real. You knew he was really drinking. And he used to stir it with his finger. He chopped off his finger, part of his finger, in an accident, and he used to joke that it was the whiskey that had disintegrated his finger. And he'd end the show by saying, "Good night, and may your God go with you." And I remember my dad especially thought that was so great. Well, Dave Allen's entire comedy was anti-religious. So he'd make fun of Catholics, but he had a running skit where the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Pope would be sort of jousting in their respective carriages. I mean, he was very, very irreverent. So we used to watch the show and loved it. So I told Baba 3 Dave Allen jokes. So once I started telling the first one, again, my poor father, I could see the sort of sweat beading on his eyes, on his forehead, because, I was telling anti-God jokes to Baba. But Baba loved them. He really did. He loved them. And he was so sweet, because that was it. I had 3 jokes. That was it. And he'd have me repeat them all the time. And he'd laugh uproariously. I mean, and I felt it was sort of a little victory for me, because I couldn't sing, I couldn't dance, and I managed to entertain him by telling him these jokes. Dara and Amrit's wedding was extraordinary. It was a wonderful, happy day, but also there was, it was obvious that Baba was not well. And that he'd made such an effort, he'd gone above and beyond, to be there, and it was so sweet. He did, I remember his laughing. The twins, my cousins, sang a few songs, and he really laughed at those. The wedding was on, whenever it was in December, I think it was on the 22nd of December, and we must have returned to England in early January, because Baba dropped his body a few weeks after we got back to England. So, Dara marrying Amrit, for me, meant I had a sister. And one time, Baba called Amrit and me to his room, and he was mostly in bed at this time. He really was. And he called us to his room, and we knelt before him, and he held Amrit and me in this big hug, where he was hugging both of us and we were hugging each other. And he said, "You're sisters now." And he did hug us for a very, very, very long time. So, we got up and said Jai Baba and all of that. Years later, Annavaz told Jay and me that when she happened to be standing and saw that, and when she saw it, she said her heart sank. And I said, "Why? Why?" And she said, "Oh." She said she'd hardly ever seen Baba hug anyone like that. And she thought, those two are going to need it. So she was almost a little fearful for, she thought Baba was giving us strength. A very memorable and very, I don't even know how to articulate it, a very important moment with Baba was when I had gone in to see him in his room. I'd just gone in and sat in his bed, to talk to him. And he was asking me a few questions. He was asking me specific questions about school and my life, asking me about life. I was 11. And suddenly we were just chit-chatting in that way, and he looked very serious, and he looked at me. And of course, Baba's eyes were incredible, just oceans, just looking and looking. And he said, "What is the most important thing that you can do for me?" And I was, taken aback, and I thought, okay, the 2 most important things are to love Baba and to obey Baba. And I thought, well, to love Baba is easy, so I will say to obey Baba, because I wanted to say the right thing. So I said that to him. I said, to obey you, Baba. And he smiled and he shook his head. And he said, no, I want you to be happy. And even at that age, not knowing much, I remember being so moved that in that context, in that moment, that was what he chose to ask of me. And I was very, very touched. And then later on, when I thought about it, I thought, oh, this is great. Baba has just waved a magic wand over me and has granted me a happy life. And, of course, I understood what he was really asking. Oh, that was one of the things I asked him when I was 7. I wanted a magic wand. He said no. I really wanted a magic wand. And so during that visit, he gave me a few orders. And I think I mentioned, yes, not to read any of his books. I can read books by him, but I can't read anything written by him. And I was telling Matthew about him. I can read books about him, I'm sorry, but I can't read anything by him. I can't read his words. And yet he made my dad read God Speaks 7 times in the space of about 4 or 5 weeks. I mean, it's just funny how that happened. And I'd like to read books by Baba, but I can't. And then the order about my hair, that came up, and thinking about it, I can't believe that I would even think to trouble Baba with something so completely unimportant. But I did. I asked him again if I could cut my hair. And he said no. And then I went to Mera. And I thought, Baba won't refuse Mera. And so I went to Mera. I said, Mera auntie, please ask Baba, can I cut my hair? And she went to him and said, Baba, Shireen lives in England. Girls in England don't have such long hair. Can you let her cut it? So I remember I was at... No. I think we were there at Marazad. But I didn't see Baba. The message came. Baba says you can cut your hair. And it should have been the best news. The minute I got that news, I thought, oh no, I don't want this. So what Baba had told me was it should be shoulder length. And that also I should go right then, go back to my grandmother's house, and that my mum should cut it. So my hair was so long and so thick, it was in one long plait. And I remember she took the scissors and just like that, and it fell. And I just remember my heart sank, and I thought, oh, how silly of me. If Baba even cared a jot about my hair, I should have just left it alone. So then the message came that we should go and see him immediately, or as soon as possible, so he could see my hair. And he, was very nice, and then he put his hand under it and said no shorter. So I got my wish in that way. And another thing that I did, which, talk about not learning your lesson, but so when I went to India when I was 7, I wanted to climb Seclusion Hill. And Baba said, absolutely not, no. And he said, you're frightened of snakes. There are lots of snakes. So, fine. But when we went when I was 11, I asked him again. So he reluctantly said yes. So a whole party of us went off. I think Darren Umbridge had already married and went off to climb Seclusion Hill. And I don't know how this happened, but I was wearing, a little dress and sandals, and I was dressed for a tea party, not for a climb up Seclusion Hill. And up we went, and everything was fine. Well, I'm frightened of heights, and I was then. So we're maybe halfway up, and I looked down and I realized I was halfway up a hill. And I had, I remember it very distinctly, I had a complete fit. I started to panic and was crying and generally making a scene. And I sort of started twirling because I was so upset. My tarantella past was catching up with me. And I fell and I landed in what I think was cactus. I don't know if there's cactus up there, but something spiny. So I landed in this bush and started screaming and really carrying on and creating a scene. Well, so the whole thing was ruined. So there were servants with us, so I think they and my dad had to carry me down. I was disheveled. I was coming out in all sorts of red blotches. I had all these spines in me. So I was taken to the house at Merazad, and there's a little room just when you go in through the front door, and I was sort of laid on a table. And then Goher came in with tweezers and started picking these spines out of me. And I was, by this time, so upset. I was crying. I knew I'd made this big fuss about going up Seclusion Hill, and I had ruined everything. So after I had been sort of cleaned up a bit, somebody said, Baba wants to see you, to see how you enjoyed your climb up Seclusion Hill. So I was, I knew I'd really made a mess of it. So I went in and tried to compose myself. And Baba, of course, was beaming, because you read this, that he's always smiling when people are going through this sort of awful, humiliation almost. And he said, "Did you enjoy going up the hill?" And I said, "Oh, yes, Baba," And what I learned later was that he had asked, I always thought it was Mera, but I don't know, he asked someone to take binoculars and to watch the progression. So, and they were giving him a blow-by-blow account. So, Manifri told us, right, so he'd say, "What's Shireen doing now?" "Well, she's in the cactus, writhing. She's screaming." Whatever it was. So he got all that, and then he asked me in this lovely way, "Well, what's Shireen doing now?" Am I forgetting anything? So the time came for our departure, and of course, it was really very sad to leave, because I suppose all of us felt that Baba was very frail, very ill, and I suppose that we might not see him again. And when I said goodbye to him, he embraced me and told me to be good and to do well in school and to look after all the things you'd expect him to say. And I asked him if I could stay at Merazad next time. And he said yes. But of course, there was no next time when he was there. During that visit, he gave my parents permission for my wedding, whenever that was to be at Merazad. So we knew that was something that we could do. So all of us went home. I'm just going to look at my notes quickly. I feel I've forgotten something that happened during that time. You can edit or cut or Photoshop, whatever it is you can do. I can tell the jokes later on if you want. So I don't exactly remember the date. So we left India in January, and Baba, it was a few weeks later that Baba dropped his body. So I remember the phone rang, it was early morning, and I remember my father shouting because he couldn't hear. And Adi Senior had phoned to tell him the news. And I could remember Baba, my dad, saying, "No, it's not true, what? It was just this big, frightening thing." And he got off the phone, and it was the first time I'd heard my father sob. And so then we all were called downstairs to the sitting room. And my dad told us that Baba dropped his body. And, we just couldn't believe it. And I think partly because we'd just seen him, that's part of it. You just can't believe it. So my dad took off either that day or the next day for India. So he went for the entombment. And if any of you have read Delia Gillian's book, and if you haven't, I really recommend it. There's her wonderful story of how she ended up going with my dad to India. And then there's my dad's version, which is slightly different. But they were there together unexpectedly. And one really beautiful thing, though, that happened when we got the news, I think it must have been that very day. So when my dad was in India in 1968, when Baba was in seclusion, but he was there to talk about the wedding, he asked Rano if she would paint a mastery in servitude for our family, and she very graciously said she would. So that was all set in motion, that was lovely. So the day Baba dropped, that we heard the news, or the day after, that mastery in servitude arrived at our house in London. It had been sent in the post from India, so just that alone is sort of pot luck that it would even get to us, but it arrived on that day, and it was so consoling. And later, when we went to India, Rano told the story that she almost never sent it to us because Baba, she said, had never before taken such interest in any of her paintings. And this particular painting of the emblem, he's touched each of the religious symbols. He sort of commented and said, no, make this a little lighter, make that a little darker. And she just thought, I don't want to give this away. He's not done this before, but she made a promise. And so that came. And that was a great consolation to us. So my dad was in India for however many weeks, I suppose, for the entombment. And he came back with a garland that had been on Baba's body. So Baba's body, I think, had been in state for 7 days, I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. And each day, I'm sure, a fresh garland was put on. So as my dad was about to leave, to return to England, he said to Erich, I really would like that garland. And Erich said, just take it. So my father came back to England with this garland, and, it was beautiful. And my mum said, oh, this is lovely, but how on earth are we going to preserve it? What are we going to do with it? And my dad said, I have no idea, I just took it. So in England, in London, or just outside London, we have the world-famous Kew Gardens. So anyone who's visited Delia will have been there. She lived just opposite, as did we, as did Matthew, and anyone else here who might have lived in one of those flats. So Kew Gardens, very, very renowned. So my parents thought, take it to Kew Gardens, they'll know what to do. So my dad made an appointment, and must have explained a little bit to the person on the phone, and this man said, come along. So my dad took the garland, explained up to a point, I suppose, whose body this garland had been on. And so the man listened and said, look, I'm so sorry, but, we can't do anything. This is a Royal Botanical Gardens. We only do work for the royal family or, the British, but not private assignments like this. So my dad was really disappointed, but accepted it, got up, said thank you, left. And then the man said, well, can you come back? Can you wait a minute, Mr. Irani? And so Dad said, okay. And the man said to him, I don't know, but I just have the feeling that this garland was on someone very special. I'm going to do it for you. So he preserved it, and he didn't charge. So the garland came back, and my mum and Amrit, put it into a frame and special glass, and we pray to that garland every day. Has been in our house, So those are very consoling Those two things, the Mastery and Servitude and then the Garland. And then, as I was saying to you, I think that once Baba had dropped his body and it was so devastating, my parents felt they wanted to do something as a way of, I suppose, assuaging their grief and just opening up their home. So they started to hold monthly meetings at our home in London, Mermansell. Baba must have dropped his body on a Friday. I think that's right. But I remember we had the Friday meetings. And that was when, all the, as Delia called it in her book, the vanguard, the young Baba lovers, in the London area and in England, certainly came through our house and started to form the various groups. So it was a different life. So if you want, I can tell you a joke. A joke or two. What time is it, please?
Time for a joke.
No, what time is it? Oh. All right, well, I will do this. And I'm just going to say, Baba really liked my jokes. So I hope you will be a forgiving audience. And I so wish I could, do it the way Dave Allen did. Oh, this is what I have to say. So Dave Allen was so irreverent, so irreligious. We think he was excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Did we confirm that? And I remember and he's since died, unfortunately. Sorry. And I always wished I could have written to him and said, you may have been excommunicated by the church, but Meher Baba, the avatar of the age, really liked your jokes. But that never happened. So Baba's favourite joke, there were three and I can only remember two of them, but his favourite one, which I repeated again and again and again, and he kept laughing, is about God and the devil. And I always slip up with the punchlines. You're just going to have to laugh anyway. Pretend that. So, in a village in Ireland, there were two very naughty boys. And they just got up to all sorts of mischief. And during apple season, one of their favourite naughty things to do was to go to the local graveyard and steal apples from behind the wall. So this is what they got into trouble, but they did this every year. So they went one night and they had their sacks, and they climbed the wall, and they're sitting on the wall, and they're pulling down the apples. And one of them said to the other, we're going to be seen, we might get into trouble. Instead of putting the apples into the two sacks, let's just put all the apples into one sack. And then when we've got them, we'll count them out, we'll divide them. So the other one said, good idea, good thinking. Meanwhile, the town drunk had just left the pub. And he was notorious, he was always drunk and, a big pain. Anyway, he was stumbling past the graveyard and walked past the wall, and he was sort of staggering. Well, something, he heard something. And he thought, what's that? He could hear this sort of talking. He thought that was strange. It was the middle of the night and, what's going on? Well, before he came along, as the boys were putting the apples into the sack, 2 apples fell outside the wall onto the ground. And one boy said, oh, what about those 2? And the other one said, don't worry, we'll get those at the end. So, okay. So there they go, and they're actually behind a gravestone. And they're dealing with their apples. So meanwhile, the town drunk comes by. And he hears these voices, and he just thinks, this is so strange. And then he can hear it. 1 for you, 1 for me. 1 for you, 1 for me. 1 for you, 1 for me. And he absolutely freezes, becomes stone cold sober, crosses himself, runs to the priest's house, raps on the door, and the priest's housekeeper comes down and says, "Oh, sorry," to the Irish, "Paddy, what do you want? You reprobate, you're drunk, go away, why are you disturbing His Highness," or whatever. And he says, "No, I've got to speak to him. I've got to speak to the priest. Something terrible is happening." And she said, "Oh, I'm going to tell your mother on you." And he says, "No, I swear on my mother's life, my grandmother's life, I swear to God, I've got to speak to his lordship. Please bring him down." So the priest comes down from the bedroom and says, "Oh, you're really in trouble now, Paddy. You know, I've had enough of you. I'm going to tell you what is it?" But he notices Paddy's like white as a sheet. He says, "You've got to come. You've got to come. God and the devil are counting out the souls at the graveyard." And so the priest is just, "No, Paddy, you are in serious trouble. You are so drunk. You're never going to the pub again. No, this is so bad. Go home." He says, "No, I beg you, I beg you." He kneels. He's just genuflecting, crossing himself. "I swear to you, it's true." So the priest thinks, well, all right, he does seem pretty convincing. So they go along to the graveyard. And sure enough, there are these disembodied voices. One for you, one for me, one for you, one for me. And the priest, also turns white and says, "Oh my God, you're right. It's God and the devil counting out the souls." And then it stops. And they're just waiting there. And then one voice says, "We forgot about the two outside." Can you imagine Barbara laughing at that? I mean, that was just... And then the other one is, it's silly. It's silly, but it's an old joke. So it's Paddy again. Paddy, he's just drinking all the time, poor thing. So it's during the day and he's gone to the pub. And he's already drunk, but he goes into the pub and there's a nun outside the pub. And she catches hold of him. And, he looks at her and she says, "Oh, I've seen you. Your name's Paddy." And he says, "Yes, what of it?" "Oh, my son, I see you come into this pub. It's not right. You're drinking your life away. And, oh, I pray for you, I pray for you, Paddy." He said, "Leave me alone, leave me alone. I want to go in." She says, No, Paddy, alcohol, it's so evil. Your poor mother, your poor grandmother, how can you do this to them? Don't drink, Paddy, don't drink. So he starts to get annoyed with this nun and says, "Leave me alone. Leave me alone to live my life." She says, No, I'm going to pray for you. So he says, "Well, how can you tell me not to drink? Have you ever had a drink in your life?" And she said, "Well, of course not. I'm a nun. Of course not." And he says, "Well, you have no right to tell me I shouldn't drink. You don't know what it's like." And she said, "Well, I mean, Paddy, you're right, but, I can't have a drink." He said, "No, you come in and you have a drink with me, and then you tell me you don't like it, and I'll stop drinking." And she said, "No, Paddy, no, I will not. The devil will not force me to go into that pub." And he says, "All right, it's up to you. Either you do it or you leave me alone and let me drink." And she said, "Well, Paddy, because, I love you and I love God and I want to do what's right, I'll do this. I'll do this." So they go in and they sit far away in the corner. So she said, "Well, I'm here, but, I don't know, what do I do? I'm so embarrassed." He said, "Well, I'll get you a drink and then you tell me what you think. And if you tell me you don't like it, I'll stop drinking." So he said, "What do you want?" And she said, "Well, I don't know. I've never had a drink in my life. I don't know." And he said, "I'll go and get you something." She said, "Well, wait a minute, Paddy. I've heard that there's a drink. It's called Jun or something." And he said, "Oh, you mean gin?" She said, "Yes, I've heard there's a drink called gin. I've heard of that." And he said, "All right, I'll get you a gin. I'll get you gin." So he's about to go off. And she stops and she said, "Paddy, I've heard that when, people have this drink, I think it's a lady's drink, don't they put tonic in it?" And he said, yes, gin and tonic, that's a common drink. I'll get you that. So he's about to go up. And then she said, Paddy, come back. She said, I've heard that a little bit of lemon sometimes goes in that drink. And he said, yeah, gin and tonic and lemon, that's a nice drink. She said, oh, well, thank you. Just get me that, I'll just take a sip. So he goes up to the bar, and then she calls him back one more time. She says, oh, Paddy, I'm a nun. Nobody should see me drinking this. This is devil's water. She said, put it in ask them to put it in a teapot. And then nobody will know, or cup and saucer, nobody will know that I'm drinking, I don't want that. And he said, all right. So he goes to the bar, and the barman says, oh, hello, Paddy. And he said, oh, hello. I'll have my usual, and also I want a gin and tonic with a lemon. And the barman says, okay, great. And then Paddy says, oh, and, can you put the gin and tonic into a cup and saucer? And the barman says, oh, the nun's back again, is she? That's it.
I wonder if you could say something about how your relationship developed with Mara and Monty after Mom was dropped body.
Oh, well, it was wonderful. It was really, really important to me. So I kept up a correspondence with them my whole life, and especially with money. And money was integral. She was the matriarch of our family. And again, how did they do it? But just like my parents did with Baba, we relied on money. We asked money everything. We asked her for advice. We were in constant communication with money. And she was, I can't overstate how important she was in my life. And Mara too, but and money was much more in that sort of practical way. So money gave a lot of advice. She, helped our family. She helped us with difficulties. She was just tremendously important. In fact, I really, really, really loved her so much and respected her beyond. And in fact, twice I was interested in 2 career paths, and my father didn't want me to do either of them. And he did what he knew would work. He wrote to Money and basically told on me. And then Money wrote to me and said no. So in each case, because she didn't want me to do that, I didn't do that. So she was tremendously important. The best compliment of my life came from her. Mara and Money organized my entire wedding, and Jay too. Jay was part of it. Organized my wedding. They did it all. I'm so lucky. And we often talk about it. I was the antithesis of what you'd think a bride would be, because I didn't have any. I did ask for a particular sari color. I asked if we could be married on a certain date, but otherwise we were so happy to just let them do it all. So as I mentioned, I feel that just getting to know them so well when I was 7 was the foundation really of my relationship. Yeah, and even though we were very far away physically, they were huge part of our lives. Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for listening.